Stop calling me. I'm in a life or death meeting. Trevor's voice snapped through the phone, sharp and incredibly impatient. It was almost funny, considering I was standing 10 feet away in the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton, Dallas. I watched him lean down to whisper something into Kelsey's ear, his hand resting possessively on her waist. Under the cold, sterile glitter of the crystal chandeliers, 27 years of marriage dissolved into the marble floor. He had no idea that I was already setting his downfall in motion. Before we go further, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't scream. I didn't run over to tear that woman away from my husband. That would have been an emotional reaction. And after 27 years of auditing corporate fraud, I've learned that emotions are just noise in a data set. I stood there, my breathing shallow and precise, watching Trevor hand over his black card. It was the same card I'd run can't just part of our monthly estate audit just last Tuesday, a routine he'd authorized years ago, blinded by the arrogance that I'd never looked closely at the merchant codes. The same card that represented the lifestyle I had built for him while he was busy playing at being a high-powered CEO. In that moment, I realized I'd been the silent investor in their version of family. I had poured my intellect, my reputation, and my time into a business partnership he called a marriage. Now, looking at the familiar way his hand rested on Kelsey's waist, I realized the contract had been breached. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years. This wasn't a heartbreak. This was an accounting error that needed correction. I sat down on a low leather chair, crossing my legs and smoothing my skirt. My knees were steady. I felt a strange, cold clarity, like the focus of a high-end lens finally clicking into place. I watched them walk toward the elevators. Trevor looked relaxed, confident in the lie he had just told me over the phone. He genuinely believed he was in control. He didn't know that I had spent the last 7 days preparing a different kind of meeting. Once the elevator doors hissed shut, I stood up. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a creditor, coming to collect. I walked to the front desk. The receptionist, a woman with neat hair and tired eyes, looked up and gave me a professional smile. "How can I help you, ma'am?" she asked. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small velvet-lined envelope. Inside was a gold dragonfly brooch. I'd found it pinned to the underside of our guest room duvet 2 weeks ago. Kelsey's signature style. At the time, I'd held it and wondered if I was losing my mind. Now, it was just a misplaced asset being returned to its owner. "I'd like to leave this for the gentleman who just checked into suite 412, I said, my voice as level as a ledger entry. "Mr. Trevor Carter." The receptionist hesitated, looking at the thick seal on the envelope. "Is this a delivery, Mrs. Carter?" she asked, her eyes flickering to my wedding ring. "It's a payment," I replied. I leaned in slightly, my gaze never wavering. "Please ensure he receives this the moment he tries to check out. Tell him his wife has paid the bill in full with 27 years of her loyalty. And tell him that from this moment on, the account is closed." She nodded slowly, sensing the lethal weight behind my words. There were no tears in my eyes. I didn't need them. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. As I turned and walked toward the glass doors, the Texas sun hit my face with a sharp, unforgiving heat. I wasn't just walking out of a hotel. I was walking out of a subscription I'd been footing the bill for since the day we said I do. Inside, my mind glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. Trevor thought he was in a meeting. He didn't realize I was the one chairing the board. I sat in the silence of my car, the steering wheel cool beneath my palms, and thought about the return on investment I'd expected from my life. In the business of auditing, we have a term called bad debt. It's an amount that is unlikely to be collected. Looking at the Ritz-Carlton through the rearview mirror, I realized Trevor was the ultimate bad debt. I had spent 27 years underwriting his failures and inflating his ego, and the interest had finally bankrupted my soul. I remember the first time I saw Kelsey. She was 21, a brilliant orphan student with a scholarship I had personally established. I saw myself in her, the same hunger for order, the same precision. I didn't just give her money. I gave her my mentorship. I brought her into the firm. I shared my contacts and taught her how to spot the cracks in a balance sheet that others missed. I was the architect of her professional life. I thought I was planting a seed of integrity, but apparently I was just nurturing a viper that would eventually find its way into my husband's hotel suite. The betrayal wasn't just romantic. It was a total loss of principle. And then there was Trevor. He likes to tell people he's a self-made man, but I was the one who drew the map. When we were young, he was a middle manager with a talent for charm, but a glaring lack of strategic depth. I spent my nights in our home office, fixing his spreadsheets and ghostwriting his proposals. I used my reputation as a senior auditor to vouch for him when the CEO position opened up. I was the silent engineer of his success, the one who ensured his house was built on rock while he was busy looking at the view. I didn't ask for credit. I thought his success was our shared equity. People might wonder why I didn't jump out from behind that plant in the lobby, why I didn't scream and demand an explanation when he told me he was in a meeting while his hand was on another woman's back. It's because I was living in a prison without bars. It's what I call the invisible chains of the survivor. When you spend nearly 3 decades being gradually erased, your birthdays forgotten, your needs treated like line item expenses, you develop a trauma response that looks like calm. You become a survivor of your own home, conditioned to stay quiet, to avoid the turbulence of a confrontation you aren't yet prepared to win. I had spent years in that cage, telling myself the locks weren't real. But standing in that lobby, I realized the bars only exist as long as you agree to see them. My silence wasn't the result of fear. It was the precision of a professional audit. I wasn't having a breakdown. I was simply reaching the conclusion section of a very long, very fraudulent report. I didn't need to scream because I already had the documentation. I wasn't just a wife anymore. I was the woman who knew exactly where the bodies and the missing company funds were buried. Trevor walked through the front door of our Fort Worth home with the practiced grace of a man who had actually started to believe his own lies. He dropped his briefcase on the foyer table and let out a long, theatrical sigh, the kind designed to broadcast the exhaustion of a busy executive. He smelled of that new, sharp cologne, a scent that felt like a foreign substance in the house I had spent 27 years turning into a home. He didn't know I was sitting in the dark of the kitchen, watching the performance from the shadows. God, it was a brutal day, Victoria, he called out, his voice already layering on the guilt as he loosened his silk tie. That meeting in Dallas stretched on for hours. I'm completely drained. He walked into the kitchen, his hand already reaching for the refrigerator handle, before he finally registered my presence. He froze, the refrigerator door hanging half open. I had placed 2 items on the granite island, positioned precisely under the pendant light. My gold wedding band and the small velvet-lined envelope containing the dragonfly brooch. Trevor's face went through a fascinating transformation. First, the color drained completely, leaving him a sickly, chalky gray. The uncertainty I had heard in the lobby earlier flickered in his eyes. But Trevor is a man who is built on my strategic depth, and he doesn't concede, he pivots. Within seconds, the initial shock was replaced by a sharp, calculated aggression. What is this, Victoria? He snapped, gesturing at the ring with a hand that had only just finished touching Kelsey's waist. Are you really having another one of your paranoid episodes? I didn't answer. I simply watched him, my mind running through the audit trail I had already started to compile on my laptop upstairs. I was in a high-stakes meeting for the future of the company, he shouted, his voice echoing off the sterile kitchen tiles. And you're stalking me at hotels? Do you have any idea how it looks for a CEO to have a wife who follows him because of some sick, delusional jealousy? He was trying to overdraft his authority again, attempting to gaslight me into believing that my own eyes were faulty equipment. He called me insane and accused me of ruining his corporate reputation just as his career was reaching its zenith. I rubbed my eyes, trying to find a single shred of the woman who would have stayed quiet to keep the peace, but there was only cold, clinical clarity. This wasn't a marriage anymore. It was a hostile takeover. He wasn't a husband defending his honor. He was a failing asset, trying to hide the fact that he was morally and professionally insolvent. You're destroying everything we built for nothing, he continued, his face turning a deep, angry red. If the board hears about this drama, you'll be the one responsible for our downfall. He was right about one thing: the board would hear about it. But they wouldn't hear a story about a jealous wife. They would hear a report about a $100,000 deficit in the investment fund that Trevor had been using as his personal playground. Are you finished? I asked quietly. He stopped pacing, his mouth still half open to deliver another rehearsed insult. He expected me to break, to cry, or to apologize for my paranoia, but I just stood up and picked up my bag. Anger wasn't a resource I was willing to waste on him anymore. I had a balance sheet to reconcile, and Trevor was finally about to see what happens when the silent investor pulls her funding. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just grabbed the go bag I had packed a week ago and left that house in Fort Worth behind. Anger is a poor fuel for an auditor, so I traded it for precision. I drove to Teresa's house, where the air didn't smell like betrayal and expensive cologne. She didn't ask for a narrative. She just handed me the key to the guest room and left a pot of black coffee on the counter. She knew that when my world fractures, I don't need a shoulder to cry on. I need a high-speed internet connection and a secure server. I also needed Catherine, the only lawyer I knew who could turn a digital audit trail into a steel trap. I sent her the first batch of evidence at 3:00 a.m. The blue light of my laptop was the only thing illuminating the guest room. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a single ounce of regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I had been quietly archiving suspicious anomalies and flagging encrypted files for months. Tonight was simply about connecting the final, lethal dots in record time. For 27 years, I had been the one to clean Trevor's corporate records, fixing the sloppiness he mistook for leadership. I knew exactly where his weaknesses were buried, because I was the one who had buried them to protect us. Now, I was digging them back up. I spent the next 8 hours tracing the investment fund he had been bragging about to the board. As a senior auditor, I know that numbers have a language of their own, and Trevor's numbers were screaming. I found the first discrepancy at 2 in the morning, a series of consulting fees totaling exactly $100,000. The recipient was a newly formed shell company called K Alpha Ventures. It didn't take a genius to figure out what the K stood for. My husband had been funneling $100,000 of company capital into Kelsey's lifestyle while I was busy worrying about the grocery budget. This $100,000 discrepancy was merely the entry point, the first thread of a much larger, systemic embezzlement scheme I was now unraveling. My compassion had been a luxury he'd overdrafted for decades, but this went beyond personal greed. I moved from the corporate records to our personal estate files. That's when the criminal twist hit me like a physical weight. I pulled up the records for our home, the one I had spent my entire adult life paying for. There was a new lien on the property. I opened the digital copy of the mortgage agreement, and felt my pulse steady into a cold, lethal rhythm. Trevor had leveraged our house for a private loan to fund Kelsey's startup. At the bottom of the page, my signature stared back at me. It was a masterpiece of deception. The same slant, the same pressure I used when I signed my name. But I'm an auditor. I know the rhythm of my own hand. Trevor had forged my signature to gamble with the roof over my head. He must have found a crooked notary to look the other way, or perhaps Kelsey had played the part of the devoted wife in some dimly lit office. Either way, he'd forgotten that a forged seal is just another paper trail for a woman like me. I sat back, watching the cursor blink on the screen. He wasn't just an unfaithful husband anymore, he was a felon. The man who had snapped at me for stalking him at a hotel was currently occupying a house he had stolen from me through fraud. This wasn't about a hotel room or a high-pitched laugh anymore. This was a hostile takeover. I didn't call him. I didn't send a threatening text. I simply downloaded every forged document and every fraudulent transaction into a master file. Trevor thought he was in a meeting, but he had no idea the audit was already finished. The report was finalized, the evidence was irrefutable, and the price of his betrayal had just shifted from emotional to criminal. The executive boardroom in Dallas was a cathedral of high-gloss mahogany and carefully curated hypocrisy. I stood outside the double doors for a moment, adjusting my blazer. Beside me, Catherine held a briefcase that contained the total liquidation of Trevor's career. I could hear his voice through the wood, rich, confident, and utterly fraudulent. He was giving a speech to the board about the importance of business ethics and the sanctity of the corporate mission. The irony was so thick, it was almost suffocating. I didn't knock. I just walked in. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. Trevor stopped mid-sentence, his hand raised to emphasize a point about transparency. He looked at me, then at Catherine, and I watched the fear finally win the battle in his eyes. This was the power flip climax I had calculated for. "Victoria?" he stammered, his CEO persona beginning to crack at the seams. "What are you doing? We're in the middle of a confidential board review. Please leave. You are making a scene." "I'm not making a scene, Trevor," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, professional edge. "I'm conducting an emergency audit. And since I am the one who actually reconciled the accounts you're currently presenting, I thought I'd provide the missing data." I walked to the head of the table and plugged my drive into the system. The screen flickered to life, showing the audit trail I had spent the night compiling at Teresa's house. I didn't look at Trevor. I looked at the board members. This $100,000 transfer is the forensic smoking gun, the definitive proof of a much larger, multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme detailed in the full report I've provided. And here is the mortgage lien on our property, secured by a signature that I certainly didn't provide. Catherine stepped forward, placing the physical documents on the table. "My client is filing formal charges for forgery and misappropriation of funds. We have the bank records and the handwriting analysis ready for the authorities. The district attorney's office has been reviewing the encrypted file since dawn, and the warrants were signed an hour ago." This was the moment of realization for everyone in the room. Trevor wasn't just an unfaithful husband, he was a criminal liability. He tried to speak, to yell, to tell them I was a paranoid wife, but the numbers didn't have feelings, and they couldn't be gaslit. I saw the board members shift in their seats, their faces turning from confusion to disgust. They were investors, and they had just realized their CEO was a high-risk gamble that had already failed. Trevor looked at Kelsey, who was sitting at the back of the room with the other staff. She looked down at her lap, her face pale, refusing to meet his eyes. What Trevor never understood was the illusion of power from an empty wallet. He believed his status was a permanent asset, but it was just a shell. His authority was a luxury he had rented with my reputation and my hard work. The moment I withdrew my support, the lease was up. He stood there, looking diminished and gray, realizing that without the stolen capital of my loyalty, he had no internal value to stand on. The door opened again, but it wasn't a secretary with coffee. Two men in plain clothes stepped in detectives from the white-collar crime unit, their badges catching the overhead light. The board's general counsel stepped forward, pointing toward Trevor with a grim expression. The finisher was here. Trevor's hand was shaking as he tried to gather his notes, but the papers slipped through his fingers and scattered across the table. He went from the practiced posture of an untouchable titan to a man who couldn't even find the words to defend his own name. He wasn't in a meeting anymore, he was in a reckoning. Trevor's world didn't just crack, it liquidated. The legal system is remarkably efficient when the audit trail is laid out with the precision of a senior partner. He is currently facing 5 to 10 years for felony fraud and forgery. Catherine made sure the divorce settlement was as cold and final as the evidence I presented in that boardroom. He lost the equity in the house he tried to steal, his standing in the community, and the career I had engineered for him. Kelsey wasn't just fired, she was blacklisted. In the world of high-stakes finance, a reputation for predatory theft is a terminal diagnosis. She is now discovering that the startup Trevor promised her was nothing more than a bubble made of stolen air. I moved into a sun-drenched condo on the east side of Dallas. It is roughly 1/4 of the size of our Fort Worth estate, but for the first time in nearly 3 decades, I don't feel like I'm suffocating in the square footage. My mornings have become a sanctuary. I wake up early, long before the city heat becomes oppressive. I make coffee. I sit on my small patio and watch the light hit the rooftops. I've come to realize that for 27 years, I was serving a lie. I was staying not because of love, but because of the sunk cost fallacy. I had invested my entire youth and intellect into Trevor, and I was terrified to admit that the investment had gone to zero. But the truth is, staying in a broken contract only wastes the years you have left. The silence in my new home isn't heavy, it's clean. I spent so long adjusting my own volume to suit his ego that existing at my own frequency feels like a revelation. Some mornings, out of old habit, I still reach for a second mug. I'll stand there for a split second, looking at it, remembering the years I spent waiting for a message or a birthday wish that never really came. Then I smile, put the mug back in the cupboard, and sit down with my single cup. It tastes better this way, not because it's sweeter, but because it's honest. If you find yourself in a similar situation, if you feel like you've become background noise in your own home, remember this: you are not a line item in someone else's budget. You are not an option to be considered when their other meetings fall through. You are the priority. Reclaiming yourself from toxic ties is the most important audit you will ever perform. I've learned that the strongest thing you can do is stop disappearing to make someone else look bigger. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't seeing them lose everything, it's becoming a person they no longer have permission to know. If my journey has given you strength today, please don't keep it to yourself. Share this story with a friend who needs a reminder of their own value. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to join our community and follow more journeys toward justice. Thank you for listening.